$30,000 a year. That's what it costs an average American family of 8 just to eat right now. An Amish family of the exact same size sits down to 3 meals a day from a single acre out the back door. No grocery run, no feed store bill, and no monthly delivery from a supply chain that could snap tomorrow. Say that grocery number again, slowly. $30,000 a year, just for food, nothing else included. Most people assume escaping that number requires a huge farm, a small tractor, and half a lifetime of effort. That assumption is flatly wrong, and the real story fits inside 1 acre, 8 mouths, and 12 months. That single number alone should make anyone reconsider what a real acre of land is actually worth. That story is older than the tractor itself, and it never actually stopped working for anyone who kept using it. By the end of this video, the exact layout Amish families use to feed 8 people off 1 acre gets covered fully. Every square foot, what gets planted where, which animals fit where, and how it all feeds itself without outside inputs. This also explains why a feed bill is a design flaw, rather than some unavoidable fact of modern life. Few investments anywhere pay off for 20 straight years from a single afternoon of effort like this one. A system producing food 12 months a year works even in a bad year, a cold state, or starting from zero today. Groceries cost noticeably more than they did 2 years ago, and considerably more than they did 5 years back. A gallon of milk pushes $4 to $5 now, and a dozen decent eggs runs close to that same range. Ground beef sits over $5 a pound across most of the country at this point in time. Facing a grocery bill this large tends to make even skeptics curious about how earlier generations managed. A family of 8 burns through $150 to $200 a week on basics alone. That covers meat, dairy, bread, and produce, before a single snack or treat even enters the cart. Watching that monthly total climb higher every year is exactly what pushes families to look for alternatives. Run that math out, and the total lands at $900 to $1,200 a month just to keep everyone fed. Stack chicken feed, rabbit pellets, goat grain, and garden inputs directly on top of that grocery number. That feed store isn't really acting as a supplier anymore. It functions more like a subscription service. A restructured food system rarely announces itself. It just quietly becomes the new normal over time. And the terms on that subscription seem to get worse with every single renewal that comes around. Here is something rarely said out loud about how this entire situation actually came to exist. That subscription model was designed deliberately. It never simply happened by pure accident over time. Sometime across the last 80 years, the entire food system on this continent got quietly restructured. Everyone, including the neighbor down the road with 6 chickens, became a customer instead of a producer. Backyard grain growing disappeared. Home dairy disappeared, and root cellars filled up with holiday decorations instead. Kitchen gardens shrunk down to a single tomato plant sitting in a pot out on the deck. Multiple generations relying on the exact same layout is a stronger endorsement than any modern marketing claim. Recognizing that the system was designed on purpose changes how the whole problem gets approached going forward. That shift was never really anyone's personal choice, and it was never really anyone's individual fault either. It was a system change that made someone else very rich, while making everyone else very dependent. Watching that monthly total climb higher every year is exactly what pushes families toward real alternatives. Anyone who has tried homesteading and felt like they were pushing a wagon uphill wasn't doing anything wrong. The hill itself was built deliberately, and that distinction matters more than it might first appear. A system built to survive depressions and pandemics deserves more attention than most modern advice gets. The Amish never really climbed onto that particular wagon in the first place, historically speaking. They arrived in Pennsylvania during the 1700s and have quietly fed their own families ever since that arrival. That held true through the Great Depression, through 2 separate world wars, and through a global pandemic. It also held true through the supply chain panic that emptied grocery shelves across the country in 2020. While much of the country learned to microwave a frozen pot pie, Amish families kept planting spring gardens. They kept a milk goat in the shed, cured hams in the smokehouse, and filled cellars every single October. That kind of quiet consistency across 2 centuries is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Their yields per acre would genuinely embarrass a lot of modern hobby farms operating today. That kind of quiet consistency across 2 centuries deserves serious attention rather than casual dismissal. None of it is magic. It comes down to a stacked layout, honest work, and decisions made generations ago. What follows isn't some new trend. It's a 200-year-old blueprint that quietly got buried over time. It got buried specifically because it never required a single purchase from any outside company at all. First, the zone map, the single piece almost every beginning homesteader gets completely wrong on day one. Most people scatter everything. Chickens over here, garden over there, fruit trees far in the back somewhere. The Amish never scatter their layout this way, and that single difference changes almost everything downstream. They divide 1 acre into 4 rough quarters, and every single quarter gets assigned a specific function. Closest to the back door sits the kitchen garden. Since a garden nobody walks past daily tends to fail by August. The next quarter overhouses small livestock, hens, rabbits, sometimes ducks, checked twice daily and fed kitchen scraps. A layout this deliberate rarely happens by accident, and that distinction matters enormously going forward. A layout this deliberate rarely happens by accident, and that distinction genuinely matters going forward. Wasted steps add up fast across a full season, even when each individual trip feels small at the time. The third quarter becomes the perennial corner, orchard, berries, and nuts planted once and left alone for decades. The fourth quarter holds grain and forage, positioned farthest from the house since it needs only occasional visits. Across roughly 100 by 436 feet of ground, 4 zones cover 4 distinct functions. 0 wasted steps result from that kind of deliberate division across the entire property. Efficiency rarely looks glamorous on camera, but it genuinely is the entire game behind this whole system. Get this layout wrong, and nothing else on this list has much chance of saving the overall result. Get it right, and the very next item on this list almost starts running itself from there. Second, the kitchen garden, the exact zone where the actual calories for a family genuinely live. In this layout, that zone runs roughly 4,000 square feet, about 1/10 of the total acre. It runs in beds rather than traditional rows, deep beds around 30 inches wide, double dug the first year. That single zoning decision alone prevents most of the wasted effort beginners hit during their first season. That single zoning decision alone prevents most of the wasted effort beginners run into during their first season. Deep beds built once tend to outperform shallow beds redone every single season for years afterward. Heavy mulch gets applied every year after that first deep digging to maintain soil structure and moisture. Researchers proved decades ago that 4,000 square feet, worked correctly, can feed 1 adult a full year's vegetables. Multiply that figure up, and it becomes clear how 8 people can eat from less ground than expected. Nothing fancy gets planted here, only genuine calorie-heavy hitters that actually carry a family through winter. Potatoes lead that list, since a well-managed patch throws several hundred pounds off just a couple hundred square feet. Winter squash follows closely, since one large Hubbard squash alone can feed a family across 3 separate meals. Cabbage earns its spot because it stores exceptionally well through the colder months without much extra effort. Dry beans provide protein that stores indefinitely once properly dried and stored in a cool, dark space. A calorie garden rarely photographs as well as a decorative one, yet it does the actual heavy lifting. Carrots, beets, onions, garlic, and enough tomatoes to fill 100 quart jars round out the full list. A garden planted out of daily sight tends to get neglected long before anyone consciously decides to quit. This isn't the pretty salad bar garden social media tends to sell people on these days. A garden planted out of daily sight tends to get neglected long before anyone consciously decides to ignore it. It functions as a genuine calorie garden, and a calorie garden planted correctly actually feeds a household. Even a truly impressive garden like this one isn't really the long game on its own, though. The real long game is exactly what grows inside the third zone of this entire layout. Third, the perennial corner. The exact quarter of an acre that pays back for 20 years from one afternoon. This is where fruit and nut trees go, alongside berry rows tucked in and around those same trees. 6 semi-dwarf apple trees. Each throw somewhere between 3 and 6 bushels of fruit yearly once mature. That works out to roughly 30 bushels combined, or close to 1,500 pounds of apples overall. Those apples cover eating fresh, making sauce, pressing cider, and drying rings for long-term storage. That kind of calorie-focused planning separates a real food system from a purely decorative garden bed. Add 2 or 3 pear trees, a couple of plum trees, and a sour cherry tree for pies. Dessert gets handled entirely without ever needing a single trip through a grocery store checkout line. That kind of calorie-focused planning is exactly what separates a real food system from a decorative garden. Along fence lines, raspberry canes and blackberry brambles hand over roughly 1 to 1.5 pounds per foot. Grapes get their own dedicated arbor near the porch, adding another layer of fruit to the whole system. A small strawberry patch, tucked near the garden, ties this entire perennial zone neatly together with the rest. A rack of curing hams tucked in a smokehouse corner is a detail most modern kitchens have completely lost. Here is a piece almost nobody plans for when first laying out a property like this one. Root cellars and canning shelves quietly do more for food security than any single fresh harvest ever could. A couple of walnut or hazelnut trees tucked into a far corner deliver free protein and fat for decades. That represents genuinely generational eating, stretching benefits well past a single homeowner's own lifetime on the land. Fruit alone, though, will never fill an actual breadbasket, which is exactly where the fourth zone comes in. Storage crops like these matter more in February than any fresh vegetable ever could during summer months. Fourth, the grain patch, quietly doing the combined work of a feed store and a bakery simultaneously. Most people assume grain cannot be grown on a small piece of ground. But that assumption is simply wrong. Amish families have been growing grain on modest acreage for generations without any real difficulty at all. Storage crops like these matter more in February than any fresh vegetable ever could during the growing season. In the back corner of the property, roughly 1/10 to 1/5 of the total acre gets used. A rotation of open pollinated field corn, soft wheat, and oats fills that space across the seasons. Nuts and berries tucked into forgotten corners of a property often go completely unnoticed until harvest time. A well-tended plot of heirloom flint or dent corn brings in 40 to 70 bushels per acre. Scaled down honestly to a smaller patch that still works out to 500 to 1,000 pounds. That corn becomes flour for cornbread, cornmeal for mush, cracked grain for hens, and whole ears for goats. Wheat delivers a couple hundred pounds of usable bread flour across a typical growing season each year. A single afternoon of planting paying off for 2 decades is rare anywhere else in modern food production. Oats feed the animals directly, while also going into morning porridge for the household itself. Nothing from this zone gets wasted, since stalks become bedding, bedding becomes compost, and compost feeds the garden. That grain patch quietly pulls double duty across the whole system, setting up the 5th zone perfectly. 5th, laying hens and meat rabbits, the exact area where this layout quietly outperforms most modern homesteads. Numbers like that are exactly why so many families start looking seriously for a genuine alternative. A tree planted correctly the first time saves years of frustration compared to moving it later on. 8 to 10 laying hens from a decent heritage breed hand over roughly 1,500 to 2,000 eggs yearly. That works out to 5 or 6 eggs a day on average, more in spring and less through winter. That output easily feeds a family of 8 breakfast every morning with leftovers for baking and trading besides. Those hens eat kitchen scraps, garden leftovers, spilled grain, and bugs, essentially everything otherwise headed to compost. Now for the rabbits, arguably the sneakiest calorie hack found anywhere across this entire 1-acre layout. Fruit trees planted with real intention outperform ones scattered randomly across an unused yard corner. 3 does, and $1 make up the entire breeding group required to run this part of the system. That small trio throws north of 180 pounds of dressed meat across a typical year. Some breeders push closer to 250 pounds using nothing but pellets, garden greens, and yard weeds. That output beats what most people get from a beef cow, from a hutch the size of a picnic table. Rabbits have long been called the poor man's steer by older generations, and that description holds up well. Fruit trees planted with real intention outperform ones scattered randomly across an unused corner of the yard. Protein alone still isn't dairy, though, and dairy makes up the sixth zone of this entire layout. Sixth, the dairy goat, since almost everyone dreams of a family cow, but almost nobody should keep one on 1 acre. A cow eats like a cow. Consuming far more than a single acre can comfortably support long-term. A goat does not share that same appetite, making it a far better fit for smaller properties. Grain grown on a small patch rarely gets credit compared to what a full commercial field produces. 2 good milking does hand over 1 to 1.5 gallons of milk each at peak production. They hold a decent output across roughly 300 days of the year under proper care and feeding. That works out to roughly 600 to 900 gallons of milk annually from just 2 animals. Grain drying under a shed roof is a quiet, unglamorous process that still feeds an entire household. Those same 2 animals eat about a fifth of what a single cow requires across a full year. They also fit comfortably in a shed, roughly the size of an average bathroom on most properties. From that milk comes butter, soft cheese, hard cheese for the cellar, yogurt, kefir, and the occasional ice cream. Grain grown on a small patch rarely gets the credit it deserves compared to a full commercial field. Leftover whey goes straight to hens and pigs if they're kept, meaning nothing from that milk gets wasted. Nothing here needs to be bought either, since goats browse brush along property edges at no additional cost. That browsing clears land that would otherwise need mowing while simultaneously turning weeds into free dairy production. Nothing here gets wasted. And that closed-loop thinking runs through every zone of this entire layout. A trio of does managed well can quietly rival what much larger livestock require far more space to achieve. Amish families figured this exact trade-off out generations ago, long before anyone formalized it as a strategy. Even a productive dairy goat won't help much in January without the 7th zone waiting in the background. 7th, the root cellar and cold pantry. The piece that genuinely closes the entire loop for good. A garden filling the table in August while leaving a family hungry by February isn't really a food system. That kind of setup is closer to a seasonal hobby than anything resembling genuine year-round security. Every Amish farmhouse keeps a real cellar, roughly 32 degrees, high humidity, dark, and completely quiet. That cellar sits stacked to the joists by the time the first hard frost of the season arrives. Nothing here gets wasted. And that closed-loop thinking runs through every single zone of this entire layout. Potatoes sit in wooden bins, carrots pack into damp sand, and cabbages hang by their roots from the ceiling. Winter squash line shelves where air can move freely, while onions and garlic hang braided nearby for storage. Eggs and rabbit meat together cover more protein needs than most people initially expect from such a small setup. Apples sit in single layers, never touching each other, arranged carefully across a simple wooden rack. A hutch smaller than most garden sheds can still outproduce livestock that need acres of open pasture. That single cellar holds roughly 1,000 pounds of food without a single watt of electricity involved. No freezer runs, and no monthly bill gets paid to keep any of that food properly stored. Beside that cellar sits a cold pantry stocked with hundreds of quart jars of preserved food. Tomatoes, green beans, applesauce, jam, pickles, kraut, broth, and canned meat all line those pantry shelves. Crocks of fermented vegetables and jars of dried herbs sit alongside cheese wheels aging on wooden shelves. Hams and bacon cure quietly on hooks nearby, completing this entire preservation setup without modern refrigeration. None of this counts as prepping in any dramatic sense. It was simply normal life for roughly 200 years. Eggs and rabbit meat together cover more of a family's protein needs than most people initially expect. It stayed normal right up until the modern freezer aisle arrived and quietly replaced most of it. A trio of rabbits quietly outperforming a full-grown cow is a detail genuinely worth remembering. Put all 7 of these pieces together, and something quietly remarkable starts happening across the whole property. None of this felt believable at first, and the very first year attempting it went badly off course. The exact mistake warned against here happened in full, scattering everything across the property with no real plan. 40 tomato plants went into entirely the wrong spot, and chickens ended up on the far side of the yard. $120 of unnecessary seed got ordered without any real thought behind the purchase. By August, a jungle of weeds had taken over. The coop sat abandoned, and the grocery bill barely moved. Standing in that overgrown mess come September brought a genuine moment of doubt about the whole approach. It felt possible that none of this ever really worked, and that older generations were simply tougher. Then, an older Amish neighbor walked the property on an afternoon and offered just 6 simple sentences. A trio of rabbits quietly outperforming a full-grown cow is the kind of detail worth remembering. Browsing goats clearing brush for free is the kind of detail that pays for itself many times over. 2 goats replacing an entire dairy aisle is a trade-off most modern households never even consider seriously. The garden should touch the kitchen, and the chickens should go wherever the scraps naturally end up. The trees should go wherever mowing isn't wanted, and the grain should go wherever it can be left alone. Pick 5 things the household actually eats every week, and grow those 5 things first above everything else. That was the entire conversation, and it completely reshaped how the whole property got planned from that point. The following year, the whole map got redrawn from scratch based on that short, simple conversation. A quiet cellar doing its job through a storm says more about resilience than any backup generator could. Beds moved, the coop moved, 6 apple trees and 3 pear trees went into the ground properly. 150 row feet of potatoes went in as well, following that same reshaped layout. The grocery bill dropped by more than half within a single growing season following those changes. That result turned genuine doubt into full conviction about this entire layered approach going forward. Here are the mistakes that wreck most people's plans, 3 of which happened here personally before correction. That kind of morning routine feels less like farm chores and more like simply collecting what already exists. Milk turned into butter. Cheese and yogurt stretches further than milk consumed fresh ever could alone. 2 goats replacing an entire dairy aisle is the kind of trade-off most modern households never even consider. First mistake, starting with animals, since everyone wants chickens and goats first because animals feel fun immediately. Animals should never come first though. The garden and trees need to go in before anything else. Animals eat what the land grows, and if the land isn't producing yet, animals become another feed bill. The fix involves getting perennials into the ground the first fall, then adding livestock the following spring. Second mistake, planting whatever looks appealing in a seed catalog instead of what a household actually eats regularly. If nobody in a household eats kohlrabi, growing kohlrabi accomplishes very little beyond wasted space and effort. The fix involves writing down every meal a household ate over the past week and growing those exact ingredients. A pantry stocked with jars represents hours of summer labor converted directly into winter security. Third mistake, having no real water plan in place before any serious planting ever begins on the property. A full acre food system needs water it can genuinely count on, not a garden hose stretched from the house. A cellar running without electricity proves resilience never actually required modern technology to begin with. The fix involves installing rain barrels, a swale, or a small pond before a single tree goes into the ground. Milk turned into butter, cheese and yogurt stretches far further than milk consumed fresh ever could alone. Fourth mistake, skipping the root cellar entirely in favor of relying purely on a purchased chest freezer. People spend thousands on a chest freezer only to lose everything the moment power fails for several days. A proper root cellar costs far less, runs completely silent, and keeps working through an actual ice storm. The fix involves digging it, building it, or converting a corner of a basement before the first harvest arrives. Getting these 4 fixes right early tends to make the entire rest of this system run smoothly afterward. Picture a property exactly like this one, 18 months after the whole layout gets properly established. It's a Saturday morning in October, and coffee gets carried outside alongside a basket for the morning harvest. The kitchen garden sits right there by the door, offering carrots, an armload of kale, and the last tomatoes. Preserved food sitting quietly on a shelf carries security a grocery store trip never quite matches. A couple of cabbage heads come along too, destined for a fresh batch of homemade kraut later that day. 6 short sentences from an experienced neighbor changed more than months of solo trial and error ever did. Walking past the coop reveals 11 eggs waiting quietly in the nest boxes from the previous night. A cellar running without electricity is proof that resilience never actually required modern technology to begin with. The goats are already up along the browse line, with one of the kids heading out with the milk pail. In the perennial corner, apples have come in, with 3 full bushels sitting on the porch awaiting the press. Under the eaves of the shed, corn hangs drying on the cob, waiting for its turn at grinding. Down in the cellar sit 400 pounds of potatoes, 60 butternut squash, and shelves of jars stacked deep. The freezer sits nearly empty at this point, since it simply isn't needed the way it once was. No grocery store visit has happened in 3 full weeks, and none feels particularly necessary right now. The feed bill for the entire month reads 0, not reduced, not smaller than the year before, genuinely 0. Writing down real weekly meals turns vague gardening intentions into a genuinely practical planting list. That kind of quiet security is exactly what this entire system is built to deliver year after year. That kind of simple, direct advice tends to matter more than any amount of research done alone. All of that came from building this entire system on a single acre of ordinary ground. So here is a genuine question worth sitting with. Which of these 7 pieces would get built first today? The garden, the perennials, the grain, the hens, the rabbits, the goats, or the root cellar itself? Preserved food sitting quietly on a shelf carries real security that a grocery store trip never quite matches. A pond or rain barrel installed early prevents a scramble for water once the growing season is in full swing. Drop that answer in the comments below, since every single one gets read and genuinely considered afterward. If this layout changed how a single acre gets looked at, hitting subscribe brings new breakdowns like this weekly. Your 1 acre is genuinely enough, your family is worth the effort, and these old methods still work today. Fixing these details early tends to save far more effort than trying to correct them after the fact.